Evolved into a war of words, with calls from several members for an independent investigation into the deaths of dozens of Palestinians protesting the occupation in Gaza. Israeli forces killed close to 60 protesters along the border with Gaza, injuring close to 1,500, and it's prompted South Africa and Turkey to withdraw their envoys to Israel. Israel's ambassador has defended the country's actions, arguing it was targeting terrorists, while the United States rejected claims that its decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem was the justification for violence. For more on this story, we cross now to our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York. Sherwin, good evening to you. The UN has had a number of ambassadors around the world reacting to events in Israel and Gaza in the last 48 hours or so. What does it all mean, though?
Well, we've just come out of a more than 3-hour session in the Security Council, this emergency session called in response to the developments we have seen across the Gaza-Israeli border. Council members, 15 of them, given the opportunity, Bongani, to express their views on this. And I think the overwhelming consensus is a call for an international investigation, an independent investigation. We've heard calls for the Secretary General himself to institute such an investigation. You heard from the Kuwaiti ambassador earlier, but it's worth reminding you that late last evening, a statement by the Security Council that would have called for such an investigation was blocked by the United States. And I think that gives you a bit of an indication of what we can expect with the proposed Kuwaiti resolution, a draft resolution that would in broad terms call for a protection force for the Palestinians, not a peacekeeping force. So it's worth investigating a little further what kind of protection force this would be. But it's worth noting that the US blocked that statement yesterday, and one can imagine that they will do the same on any proposed resolution if it is put to a vote.
Sherwin, I suppose that really then brings into question, the US's support, unflinching support for Israel. Ambassador Nikki Haley quite steadfast in the US's approach to Israel. Isn't this, many critics would say, this is at the core of Netanyahu's emboldenment to deal with the Palestinians in this way?
I think, Bongani, there are a number of situations around the world where we can point to veto-wielding members of the Security Council and their influence in stymieing the broad collective. I mean, essentially, you had 14 members on that statement yesterday wanting to move ahead with the statement calling for an independent investigation. This is nothing controversial. An investigation that would an independent panel that would investigate developments on the ground. They blocked this, and it really speaks to a broader problem of UN reform. The fact that you have these 5 powerful members, many, 2 of them in particular, the United States and Russia, tend to use their vetoes more than others. But it does speak to the notion that bilateral relations trump the multilateral forum that is the UN Security Council. The United States today, through their ambassador Nikki Haley, defending again President Trump's December decision to move the United States embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this was really taken on by Palestinian ambassador Riyad Mansour in the council, where he talked about this wanton undermining of international law, this wanton undermining of Security Council resolutions, which in his viewpoint was trumps the sovereignty that the United States talks about in terms of their sovereign decision to move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So he believes that the United States is flouting international law and believes that the Security Council needs to take action against the United States. Of course, there was also the Israeli perspective, and their argument essentially is that these were not peaceful protesters along the border. These were terrorists. They believe that Hamas is an international terrorist organization, despite the fact that they're an elected government in the enclave of Hamas. And they believe that these so-called terrorists were trying to infiltrate the border fence along that border so that they will then infiltrate the territory of Israel and target Israeli citizens. So their position is that they are protecting Israeli citizens from these terrorist infiltrators. But the broader consensus here at the United Nations is that these were, by and large, peaceful protesters, many of whom were civilians who were gunned down by Israeli Defense Force snipers along that border yesterday.
Of course, the issue of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem remains front of mind, but there are others. Part of the provocation from a Palestinian point of view, Sherwin, would have been, of course, this is all happening on the 70th anniversary of the great catastrophe, as the Palestinians would call it, with preparations underway for the Great March of Return. The timing of all of this was surely something that was quite unfortunate.
Well, also the timing, I think, has been used by both sides in many ways to really push their points home. Yesterday, of course, was the anniversary, the 70th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel, and today is the 70th anniversary of the removal of Palestinians from their ancestral homeland. And for all intents and purposes, that is what these protests that we've been seeing over the last number of weeks, Bongani, that's what this is about. You know, Israel's ambassador making the argument that they actually did leave Gaza in 2005. They went away. Israeli Defense Force contingents moved out, and that's when Hamas was elected, and that's why they feel they needed to return and create this blockade around Gaza, including the massive wall that they've built around this enclave. But yes, certainly, both sides will argue that they've used these historic occasions as a propaganda tool to push whatever narrative it is they seek. But if we are to listen to the other council members around that table, particularly the European nations today, who spoke very much about the need for the Security Council to have a say in what happens in this long-standing conflict. You know, the occupation is now in its 51st year. And for all intents and purposes, the Security Council has grown silent in terms of pushing the sides closer together because of this argument that's certainly being pushed by the United States, that we require direct negotiations and we don't need international interference. What you're beginning now to see from the European nations is that they want the Security Council to have a say in terms of what happens in the future. How they get that done in terms of the current laws that govern the Security Council is the big question we face today.
Indeed, that's our Sherwin Bryce-Pease on the line from New York.